at 0730 on the morning of the 1st of November 1943, the coastline of Bougainville slowly emerged from the mist. From the bridge of the command ship Macaulay, Lieutenant General Alexander Vandegrift watched the shoreline in silence. In less than 2 hours, 14,000 U.S. Marines would storm the beaches at Empress Augusta Bay. Every man there understood what this usually meant. Island warfare against Japan was paid for in blood. Yet something was missing. Just 250 miles to the northwest sat Rabaul, the most heavily fortified Japanese stronghold in the South Pacific. More than 110,000 Japanese soldiers, sailors, and airmen were stationed there. Its airfields, coastal guns, and underground fortresses had been built for one purpose: to crush exactly the kind of landing Vandegrift was about to launch. And yet, the enemy did not come. Vandegrift knew what a frontal assault against Japanese defenses looked like. He had commanded at Guadalcanal. He understood how even small islands could consume thousands of lives. Rabaul was not a small island. It was a fortress that made Tarawa look like a rehearsal. For nearly 2 years, Allied strategy had pointed toward one inevitable conclusion: Rabaul must be taken. Every map, every plan, every casualty estimate led to that objective. But on this morning, as the Marines moved toward Bougainville, the most powerful Japanese base in the region stood silent. Why? How did a fortress designed to dominate the South Pacific end up watching the war pass it by? And how did a decision not to fight become one of the most important strategic victories of World War II? For Allied planners in 1943, Rabaul was not just another enemy base. It was the centerpiece of Japan's defensive system in the South Pacific. Captured from a small Australian garrison in February 1942, Rabaul had been transformed over 20 months into a fortress on a scale unseen elsewhere in the theater. Simpson Harbor alone could shelter more than 100 ships. 5 major airfields ringed the harbor, their concrete runways capable of supporting Japan's heaviest bombers. Hundreds of aircraft sat protected in revetments carved into volcanic soil. The defenses were staggering. More than 360 anti-aircraft guns covered every approach. Coastal batteries guarded the beaches. Thousands of machine guns were positioned in bunkers and pillboxes. Beneath it all lay an underground city, miles of tunnels housing barracks, hospitals, command centers, and ammunition dumps buried so deep that no bomb could reliably destroy them. By mid-1943, over 110,000 Japanese troops were stationed at Rabaul. American intelligence officers would later call it the Pearl Harbor of the South Pacific. From the beginning, Allied strategy revolved around this stronghold. After Guadalcanal, every major planning document pointed toward Rabaul as the ultimate objective. Control Rabaul, and the sea lanes of the South Pacific would belong to the Allies. General Douglas MacArthur called it the key to the theater. Admiral Ernest identified it as the primary target for 1943. Operation Cartwheel was approved specifically to encircle and capture Rabaul by early 1944. But as intelligence estimates grew more detailed, a troubling picture emerged. Rabaul's geography offered only a handful of narrow landing beaches, all covered by interlocking fields of fire. Japanese commanders, having learned from earlier island battles, had designed their defenses to negate American advantages in naval gunfire and air support. Bombardment would be absorbed by tunnels. Air support would fly into dense anti-aircraft fire. Any landing force would be forced into a confined killing zone. Casualty projections were brutal. Analysts estimated that an amphibious assault would result in losses approaching 30% in the opening phase alone. That meant tens of thousands of Americans killed and wounded, assuming everything went right. Weather delays, reinforcement from nearby Japanese bases, or a failed naval bombardment could push losses even higher. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison would later write that even Tarawa, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa would have seemed pale by comparison. At the same time, the ground war advancing toward Rabaul painted an equally grim picture. In New Guinea, American and Australian forces fought through jungles, swamps, and mountains where disease claimed more men than bullets. Battles at Buna and Gona dragged on for months over objectives that barely appeared on a map. Every mile forward was paid for dearly, and every success brought Allied troops closer to the strongest Japanese position in the Pacific. By mid-1943, commanders were forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. The traditional path advance, assault, and seize was leading toward a battle whose cost might outweigh any strategic gain. Rabaul remained the objective on paper, but in practice, the question had begun to change. Not how to take Rabaul, but whether taking it was necessary at all. If Rabaul could not be taken by ground forces without catastrophic losses, Allied commanders hoped it could be broken from the air. Strategic bombing offered an alternative that promised results without beach assaults, and in late 1942 and early 1943, Rabaul became the ultimate test of that belief. The first man to stake his life on that theory was Brigadier General Kenneth Walker. A passionate advocate of air power, Walker believed that properly applied bombing could neutralize any target. Rabaul was his proving ground. His early raids in 1942 accomplished little. Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire drove off bombers before serious damage could be done. Walker insisted persistence would succeed, where caution had failed. On the 5th of January 1943, he led a daylight raid against Simpson Harbor with 12 heavy bombers. Against orders to strike at dawn, Walker delayed until noon, flying directly into the most heavily defended airspace in the Pacific. Japanese fighters rose from multiple airfields. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. Walker's B-17 pressed on, scoring hits on ships below before being overwhelmed. His aircraft vanished into the clouds, never to be seen again. Walker received the Medal of Honor, but the raid proved a harsh truth. Courage alone could not dismantle Fortress Rabaul. Later that year, General George Kenney attempted scale where bravery had failed. On the 12th of October 1943, the 5th Air Force launched its largest strike of the war, 349 aircraft attacking all 5 Rabaul airfields simultaneously. Initial reports claimed devastating success. Headquarters celebrated. Press releases declared Rabaul's air power neutralized. Within 48 hours, Japanese engineers had repaired the runways. Aircraft losses had been exaggerated. Fuel dumps had been emptied weeks earlier. Rabaul remained fully operational. Kenney tried once more on November 2, with a low-level assault, designed to overwhelm defenses through sheer aggression. Medium bombers skimmed Simpson Harbor so low their propellers threw spray from the water. The Japanese response was ferocious. Elite carrier pilots, recently redeployed to Rabaul, tore into the attacking formation. 19 Allied aircraft failed to return. Major Raymond Wilkins led his squadron straight through the fire, destroying enemy ships before sacrificing his aircraft to protect others. He too received the Medal of Honor. Rabaul absorbed the blow and endured. While bombers bled in the skies, the ground war to the south offered no comfort. In New Guinea, American and Australian units fought an enemy that refused to retreat or surrender. At Buna and Gona, months of combat for 2 small villages cost thousands of casualties. Disease ravaged entire units. Jungle fighting reduced modern warfare to hand grenades, flamethrowers, and close-quarters killing. If such costs were paid for villages and airstrips, what price would Rabaul demand? By November 1943, the evidence was undeniable. Air power alone could not destroy Rabaul. Ground assault promised losses beyond any rational calculation. The strongest base in the Pacific had resisted every conventional solution. And in that failure, a new question emerged, one that would redefine how the war would be fought from that moment forward. By late 1943, Allied commanders were staring at a year of hard evidence. Rabaul had been bombed repeatedly, at enormous cost, and remained operational. Ground forces had fought their way through jungles and swamps toward the fortress, only to learn that every mile closer came at a price far higher than anticipated. The problem was no longer tactical, it was mathematical. The turning point did not arrive as a dramatic revelation, but as an accumulation of calculations. Intelligence estimates showed that assaulting Rabaul would require at least 60,000 assault troops, and likely far more once support units were included. Casualty projections ranged from 30 to 40% in the opening weeks. That meant 20 to 30,000 killed or wounded, numbers that would cripple future operations. Even success would bring little reward. Rabaul was a base, not a decisive objective. Its value lay only in its ability to project power. The question then became unavoidable. What if that power could be taken away without invasion? This idea was not new. Decades earlier, Marine Corps strategist Earl Hancock Ellis had argued that Japan could be defeated by seizing key positions while bypassing others, strangling enemy garrisons through control of sea lanes and airspace. In mid-1943, that theory resurfaced in Washington. The Joint Strategic Survey Committee examined Rabaul and reached a blunt conclusion. Capturing the fortress offered little promise of reasonable success and would severely delay future operations. General George C. Marshall became the strongest advocate of this new direction. He viewed the Pacific War through the lens of logistics and opportunity cost. Every division committed to Rabaul was a division unavailable for Europe. Every ship tied down supporting an invasion was one not carrying men and supplies across the Atlantic. Marshall reduced the problem to a single question. How many lives was Rabaul worth? There was no answer, because no number justified the cost. Others arrived at the same conclusion from different paths. General George Kenney, after months of failed air campaigns, realized that Rabaul could not be destroyed, but it did not need to be. If Allied airfields could be built within fighter range, Japanese aircraft could be suppressed daily. Runways could be cratered faster than they could be repaired. Submarines and patrol aircraft could cut off shipping. The garrison would remain alive, but strategically dead. Resistance remained. General Douglas MacArthur had planned for Rabaul since 1942. Bypassing it felt like abandoning the very objective his campaign had been built around. Yet even MacArthur could not ignore the reality unfolding on the maps and casualty charts. The war was demanding a different kind of victory, one defined not by captured ground, but by enemy irrelevance. The old assumption that every stronghold must be taken was collapsing. In its place emerged a quieter, more ruthless logic: deny the enemy the ability to fight, and the fortress would defeat itself. The debate over Rabaul reached its decisive moment in August 1943, far from the jungles and airfields of the South Pacific. In Quebec City, American and British leaders gathered for the Quadrant Conference to coordinate strategy across a global war. What to do about Rabaul dominated the Pacific discussions. General George C. Marshall arrived prepared. He laid out maps of Rabaul's defenses, intelligence estimates of Japanese strength, and casualty projections for an amphibious assault. His argument was deliberately unemotional. Assaulting Rabaul, he explained, would consume divisions needed elsewhere and produce losses the Allies could not replace quickly. Even if successful, the operation would achieve nothing that isolation could not accomplish at far lower cost. Rabaul threatened Allied operations only if it could operate. Deny it air and sea access, and the fortress became irrelevant. Admiral Ernest J. King supported Marshall without hesitation. The Navy, he argued, lacked the ships and aircraft to both invade Rabaul and sustain the growing offensive across the Central Pacific. One operation would have to give way to the other. King was blunt. Resources spent taking Rabaul would delay the advance toward Japan itself. Strategically, the choice was obvious. MacArthur's representatives resisted. They warned that leaving a major Japanese base intact would endanger supply lines and damage Allied credibility. Marshall responded with numbers. How many casualties would justify capturing a base that offered no strategic return? The silence that followed answered the question. The British chiefs sided with Marshall. They, too, were fighting a war of limited resources and saw no value in an assault that promised only bloodshed. On the 24th of August 1943, the decision was formalized. Rabaul would not be invaded. Instead, Allied forces would seize positions at Bougainville, the Green Islands, and the Admiralties, building airfields within range to maintain constant pressure. Naval and air power would isolate the fortress. The garrison would be contained, not destroyed. The directive reached MacArthur's headquarters in September. Years of planning were rendered obsolete overnight. After a long silence, MacArthur ordered his staff to replan. The objective shifted west toward New Guinea and ultimately the Philippines. Rabaul faded from centerpiece to obstacle. What followed validated the decision. Carrier strikes against Rabaul in November shattered Japanese surface forces in Simpson Harbor. Airfields built on Bougainville placed Allied fighters over the base daily. Supply convoys turned back or were sunk. By early 1944, Rabaul was surrounded, its massive garrison trapped in a fortress that could no longer influence the war. Across the Pacific, commanders took note. Admiral Chester Nimitz applied the same logic in the Central Pacific, bypassing heavily defended islands in favor of lightly held objectives that offered airfields and anchorages. Casualties fell. Operational tempo increased. The war changed character. Victory was no longer measured by ground seized, but by enemies neutralized without battle. Rabaul had not been conquered. It had been rendered meaningless. By early 1944, the fate of Rabaul was sealed not by invasion, but by neglect. Allied airfields on Bougainville, New Britain, and the Green Islands placed constant pressure on the fortress. Fighters swept over Rabaul daily, destroying aircraft as they attempted to take off. Bombers cratered runways faster than they could be repaired. Submarines turned Simpson Harbor into a graveyard of sunken ships. Supply convoys stopped trying to reach the base. 110,000 Japanese troops remained alive, armed, and dug in but strategically useless. From the outside, Rabaul still looked formidable. Its tunnels remained intact, Its guns still pointed seaward, but power had drained away. Without ships, the garrison could not project force. Without aircraft, it could not contest the skies. Without supplies, it could not sustain offensive action. The fortress had become a prison. For Japanese commanders, the realization was devastating. Vice Admiral Jinichi Kusaka had prepared for a final, decisive battle in which his garrison would fight to the last man. That battle never came. Instead, Rabaul was ignored. Months passed. Bombing raids continued, but no invasion followed. Soldiers planted gardens, rationed food, and waited for reinforcements that would never arrive. The psychological toll was profound. Defeat came not through combat, but through irrelevance. The impact of the Rabaul decision spread quickly across the Pacific. American planners no longer assumed that every enemy position had to be captured. They asked different questions. Could it be isolated? Could its power be neutralized without direct assault? Increasingly, the answer was yes. Bypass operations became standard practice at Truk, Wewak, Kavieng, and dozens of other Japanese strongholds. Casualties dropped sharply. The pace of advance increased. Strategic momentum shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. After the war, there were no parades celebrating the decision not to invade Rabaul. No medals were awarded for the tens of thousands of lives saved by restraint. Yet historians would later recognize it as one of the most important strategic choices of World War II. General George C. Marshall would quietly note that bypassing Rabaul shortened the war and preserved irreplaceable manpower. It was a victory measured not in ground taken, but in lives not lost. Today, the remnants of Rabaul lie silent beneath jungle growth and volcanic ash. The tunnels remain, the runways are cracked and overgrown, the harbor is calm. What endures is the lesson. Strategy is not about fighting every battle offered. It is about choosing the battles that matter. And sometimes, the most decisive victory comes from having the wisdom not to fight at all. If this story made you pause and think, share your perspective below. Was bypassing Rabaul an act of courage or cold calculation? And what lessons from this decision still apply to the conflicts of our own time?